with AI obviously coming into the world, there's also the topic of what makes writing good and what are some examples of good writing, particularly in gaming as well. And I think it has been getting better over the years. I think it's also gotten worse in a lot of ways because people want to make the most mass marketable product of all time, and as a result, they can't have anything remotely controversial in their writing. But sometimes we get good stuff, and I think it's worthwhile celebrating that good stuff as well. So, I guess, Matt, what's an example for you that's a game with fantastic writing?
A game with fantastic writing. Um, you know what? I'm going to say Yakuza Zero. More than all the other Yakuza games, even. Yakuza Zero just has incredible writing. You know what it is? It's because it is so perfectly written for the 80s. It's just it collects all the kind of the weird and wonderful things about the 80s, and then represents them in a way that doesn't feel dumb, like it doesn't feel stupid. It just feels very entertaining, and appropriate to the times. They've done a really good. They do such a good job of really kind of capturing the essence of that decade through the writing in that game, and I think that's what kind of helps it to stand out. All the Yakuza games have good writing, but Yakuza Zero, for that extra element that it also has that time, um, the it has the unique kind of qualities of the era built into it. I think that one stands out for me as probably my go-to example of really good game writing every time somebody asks me.
It's fun. It's also like enthralling. Like that's one of the few games that has, like half an hour long cutscenes that I don't feel the urge to skip.
And it's got like for a really good example of it, and something that I've never forgotten. It's been ages since I played Yakuza Zero, but I still remember this one particular scene that just in one of the side stories, it's not even the major plot, it's just something that happens along the way. But Kiryu runs into a politician of the time, and for whatever reason, they end up going and getting food and drinks and whatever. And the politician asks for Kiryu's opinion about stuff, about tax and whatever. Um, and Kiryu shares his opinion, and the result is like um, that, or I mean, from later on that in history that Japan had changes to tax. For example, it had the goods and services tax come in, and there's that really kind of really funny moment where you realize that the Yakuza guy was the kind of the cause of the Japanese GST coming in. So, it has
Like a
those kind
Forrest
of
Gump moment.
yeah, it has those kinds of moments which is just really, really funny to think about, and have that historical context, and they're just really kind of written so um so elegantly into the script. It doesn't feel contrived. It just feels like a natural conversation that these two people have. And as a result of that conversation, Japan ends up with its tax reform driven by a guy from the Yakuza. It's funny, and it's clever, and it's just really well written in that way.
The funny thing about Yakuza, I just had this thought. I've only played that game for about an hour. I know. I'll get to it. But the only thing I know about the
You
gameplay has
preempted me
been
being
that
like,
hour
"Oh,
of
you got to
play.
play it."
I know everyone says this, but I know so much about the story and the humor and the tone of the game because everything I've seen of the game, like all the screenshots, all the memes, everything has been dialogue. I've never seen like videos of what the game looks like when someone's actually playing
Actually,
it. I've
you
just
are
seen
true.
conversations.
Like that game was. I mean, one of the reasons that that game was so successful, and it was kind of the breakout for the Yakuza series in the West. It went from being a fairly niche series to being something that has, is as mainstream as Japanese games get. And the breakout moment was Yakuza Zero, and the reason for that was people sharing all these memes of the dialogue. It was just such a dialogue-driven game. A lot of people didn't even realize it was kind of an action thing until they picked it up, but they definitely picked it up because it was just such a funny and well-written script. And that's rare. It's really
So it
rare for a
helps as
game
well
to
that they
sell
had
itself
that.
purely on script.
It had the character of Mr. Libido, and that was a meme for like, I don't know, let's say like 5 months, 6 months, which is massive for a game series that otherwise was very limited at the time.
Yeah,
Especially coming off the back of five, which was super, super niche, even within Yakuza, because it was like different and weird.
yeah, yeah.
It's good though. That game's awesome. Zero is great. I think it's genuinely phenomenal.
Yeah,
It's also like it's
it's
just nice. It's a nice game.
it's definitely probably, I don't know. I'll have to wait and see how Ishin settles down for me. Now that I've relatively recently played it, so it's still quite new, and my enthusiasm for it is quite high as a result. But in a year or so, it'll be interesting to see where it settles down. It'll be either Yakuza Zero or Ishin. That's kind of my favorite in the whole series. Ishin, for a similar reason, it's just really well written. It uses the historical context in a really clever way. Um, and actually, that game is a really fascinating example of writing as well, in that it uses all the characters from the Yakuza series, right? It's got all the faces, Kiryu's face and Mijima's face, and all the rest of them, but it puts them on characters um, from the Shinsengumi era, from the you know 100 odd years ago, 200 years ago. It kind of has a theatrical quality as a result. It's like you're watching a play that these characters are dressed up in these costumes and they're doing a performance, as
Which
opposed
is
to,
the literal exact face on some other characters.
yeah, it's the exact face. Like
That's
it's
so
And
funny.
Kuzayan from Zero.
it's the
Did
exact
they put that
face.
one Japanese actor?
Yeah, no, all the characters'
Yeah,
exact faces on these samurai. So it
That's
does.
so funny.
so
It
good.
really has, like I said, it has this really theatrical quality. It's like watching characters in a movie. It's like
Yeah, it's
watching.
like famous actors playing these
Yeah,
historical characters. That's
exactly.
so funny.
Exactly. That's
What a good
exactly the quality
idea.
it has. And it's really clever. It really um it's weird at first, but when you get into its rhythms, it's just really great quality to the game as well. It's not technically writing, I guess, but you're definitely seeing like your favorite actors as such playing a role in that game. So
So the characters are written so well that you get excited to see them play different roles.
yeah, exactly. Even though they're actually just characters, they're not people. But yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
it's very meta. It's very, very meta.
Mm.
I love that. I mean, Yakuza as a whole is just written in such a bizarre and odd way where it has this tone that is constantly straddling serious and the silliest nonsense you've ever seen in your life. And not many games can do that. A lot of games try to do that and they end up being frustrating and millennial humor. And I cannot stand it. But Yakuza gets it. And
Yeah,
I
it's
really like that.
it's it's a rare case of a game that can be both serious and stupid and not
Or is it
break
stupid? Oh, it's
eh,
stupid.
and not kind of break its atmosphere in doing so. It can move between those quite effortlessly. That's not easy to do. It's very, very difficult to give you characters in a situation that you care about in a serious sense, but also then really ham it up and make sure that you're being entertained by how silly it can be at the same time. That's always a good example
Yeah,
of writing when they can do that.
it's pretty neat. At the risk of just sounding like the most like weak take of all time, I just like that sort of stuff. I think it demands a lot of respect because to put that level of effort in to get that and make it work is so much harder than doing a Marvel style dialogue thing that every
Yeah, it's
modern
like
game for a
Joss
while was
Whedon
doing.
Yeah,
dialogue, everybody.
speaking of the exact opposite of good writing, let's talk about Forspoken and and its Marvel style writing
God,
there. That game
that
died
game
quick.
should have been so much better.
It should have
It's
been.
such a shame.
Yeah, just need to be written better.
And
It's
like
a really good
also
example of like
be
otherwise a
marketed.
fantastic game that gets killed by the writing.
It's a good example of why writing is important to video games. um, it's something that we too often take for granted, especially in the bigger space, because a lot of writing is quite flat and designed to be just kind of milled into the background and something you experience. Again, Ubisoft games being a good example of that. Just something you kind of flow through as you work through the content. But yeah, when the writing is either exceptional, like it is in the Yakuza series, or that bad, like it is in Forspoken, it kind of reminds you of just how important it is to the script. It is to the experience anyway.
I think players are trained to not
Yeah,
notice it now. Like people that I wouldn't guess what percentage, but like a pretty decent amount of people I know who play games will just skip all cutscenes. because they've been trained that
I
they don't
hate
matter.
people that do that. Can I just say, if you're one of those people that just skips through cutscenes without paying attention to them, you're the worst person.
But if
Well, you're
all you
playing
play
Borderlands
is
3.
like GTA and
No,
Watch
because
Dogs, right?
what
Do
happens?
you lose anything?
What happens is they skip through the cutscenes and they're like, I don't understand what's going on.
Yeah,
Everybody knows the person that's done that. Like they just skip through the cutscenes
that's
and then
me. You're talking to me.
I don't understand. Alan, you are the worst person. You are terrible. You're a horrible human being.
I just didn't want to listen to Rex talk about Pyra's titties for like 4 hours. That was what I
That
wanted
was
to avoid.
that was important character development.
Yeah. You know what? You're right. I take it back. I'm so sorry. It was really important. It's so important. I remember finishing Xenoblade 2 and flossing because I was quite drunk at the time, all the way through the final cutscene because I just didn't give a shit. And then when Milton died in Torn of the Golden Country, I played the Crab Dance song because I didn't have any respect for that game's story either. 3 was a completely different story because 3 was a good story.
3 had a really good story, didn't it? It was
Is it the same
3 was
scenario
fantastic.
writer that all through the Xeno series?
yeah.
What
Yeah, I
happened
think
for
so.
2?
Oh, he just got horny into
Oh.
like that's
Yeah.
he was obviously going through a dry patch and he just let it out in his video game. That's
Because like Xeno's Saga is horrifically existential, questioning
Horribly
of what
depressing.
is a human, and then we hit Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Like, what happened in that period of time?
I'm telling you, he just got
Xenogears
horny.
is
He just had a dry patch, needed to get it out somehow, and he had an outlet, so he
and
ran
was
with
like,
it.
right, the way to do this is to make a tiny puffball who is running around with a sex maid. That's the solution to our problems. Nintendo will love this. uh, yeah, but no, 3 is actually pretty well written. I would say that's a pretty well written game, and I'm trying to avoid the obvious examples here because like I always bring them up. And there's no point in me bringing it up again. You know what I mean? Like I could say, yeah, Pathologic's really well written. Yeah, it is. Cool. Moving on.
Pathologic
Disco
is
Elysium's really
yeah,
well written.
but Pathologic is an interesting example because um it's really well written, but at the same time it's not written in any conventional way whatsoever, you know? Um
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
is
my English teacher brain hates that game.
it is really well
The
written,
Cloud Street of video games.
but it's
I hate that, but
just
you're right.
it's just very unconventional for a video game, and I think a lot of people would play it and think that it's not well written because of that reason. Like you've got to have an appreciation to theater for theater to get pathologic, I think.
I think it demands a lot of you. It demands
It
that like
really is a
even
very
if you
demanding
don't
one.
It's an
Yeah.
exhausting.
understand,
It's like
you
reading
try
La
to figure it out.
Nausea.
Yeah, it is a really
It's true.
demanding game. Like it's rare because most video games try not to be demanding of the player. Like they don't ask the player to do much because you're trying to sell to the biggest possible audience, and the more you ask of players, the more players you lose along the way. Um,
Mm.
but Pathologic's just like, well, no, we're just going to ask the world of our players, and we're making something that's really genuine, you know, potent art. Um,
They've been doing that for years, though.
it's
With
actually
bloody The Void.
it's actually it kind of borders on pretentious, Pathologic.
Oh, it is.
Yeah,
He loves it.
I love it.
Funny that there's not many games like that though that have an air of pretension to them, or are just like, hey, pay attention, or you're not going to understand this.
Yeah, because again, the more you ask of players, the more pretentious you are, the higher art you kind of pitch, the more rapidly you lose players. I mean, that was fundamentally the problem with the original Nier, um, not Automata, Replicant. Uh, the only reason that that game got a remake and then people discovered it and realized it was actually quite a good game was because Nier Automata was much more accessible. But the original Nier is um, an incredibly dense game to really connect with. So yeah, and then that's
Like
that's another
every other
example of a really
medium,
well written game. Nier is just and Nier Automata as well. They're both beautifully written games.
Every other medium has those texts, though. Every other medium has something that demands huge amounts from the reader or the audience,
Oh
and
yeah,
those
absolutely.
things are like revered as the best of the medium.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, cinema, for example, Citizen Kane is a very demanding film, and we kind of reference it as the example of film as art. You know, everybody's like the Citizen Kane of this or Citizen Kane of that. It's like the epitome of the medium, and it is a very demanding film. If you watch it yourself, if you haven't watched it before, go and watch it, and you'll see what I mean. Um, it is dense to work through. The more you watch it, you kind of learn to appreciate it. But the first time through is quite difficult. Shakespeare's the same thing, you know. Shakespeare plays pretty demanding of their audience today because you've got to understand the language and you've got to the poetic nature of them is not inherent to us by any means. I know originally that those plays were kind of populist, but these days they're quite dense. And again, we kind of hold Shakespeare up as this epitome of the form. Um, we don't really do that in video games. In video games, we kind of look for the most accessible and the most easy to consume products as our kind of examples are great. I mean, look at Last of Us. It spoon feeds every word of the experience to you. It kind of treats its players like idiots, and yet it's held up as a great example of the form. I don't think it's particularly well written myself, but there you go. It's a very different experience in video games. Mind you, we do have other ones that within their circles are pretty well respected. Like Disco Elysium is a really good example, which Alan mentioned earlier. Really well written game. It did all right for
Yeah,
itself as well.
apart from the developers being forced out of their own company. Um, I think the issue behind that and why a lot of the more demanding like narrative games don't get the attention that they probably deserve is because games as a medium is already quite niche. Like to play a video game, like my dad isn't going to go out and buy a copy of Disco Elysium. You know what I mean? He's
Mm.
already not interested in that as a concept. So of course he's not going to experience something like Disco. He's not going to experience Pathologic because those games rely on you not only having a high reading ability or high like narrative conceptual ability, but also mechanical understanding and mechanical ability as well. And you
Yeah.
can't really fail at reading a book. You can't really fail at watching a movie because you can still at the end of the day watch it or read it with your eyes. You might like require like a little bit of help with it perhaps if you don't understand something or if you need to look up a word or whatever, but you can't die reading a book.
I don't
You know
know
what I
about
mean?
that.
Like
You
you
can,
can't
you probably
fail.
can.
Give
No, but
up.
A scenario for
you
you,
could
Alan,
give
right? You're reading a book in a bath, right? You're having a really nice time reading a book in the bath, but the book starts to put you a little bit to sleep. You know, you start to doze off, and before you know it, you're drowning. You can die
but
reading
if
a
I'm
book.
reading Tim Winton's Cloud Street, that's a guarantee.
You can
I hate
definitely
that book
die
so
reading a
much.
book.
No, no, you know what I mean. Like
I know
you
what
can't
you
like
mean.
get a
Yes.
fail state of reading the book.
Yes, absolutely.
It won't punch you in the face if you haven't comprehended what the chapter means.
And there's
Yeah,
also,
if you don't understand a symbol, you're not going to get yelled at by your English teacher when you're 30 years old and have working a day job.
you're totally right. And I mean, there's also the fact that a lot of people, a lot of people that are able to play games, you know, are comfortable playing video games, they're not coming to video games looking for works of art. They're looking for the skill testing side of video games. They want to play the sports games, for example. They're not looking for a story in a sports game, or they're wanting to play Fortnite. You know, they want to play it as kind of a competitive sporting activity as such. So they're not looking for narrative either. The niche for narrative, artful driven kind of games is very small.
I
Yeah,
was about to
Yeah, and I
say,
think there's
I think that the amount of people in the world who play video games is probably higher than the amount of people who go to theater. But
oh,
yeah,
it's
I
much
don't think
higher.
the amount
It'd
of people
definitely be higher.
who play games for story is higher.
Yes, that's it. I think the audience for video games is right up there. I think I don't know if it's actually larger than cinema now. I mean, I know they get more money, but then video games cost more than cinema tickets. So I don't know the actual numbers, whether they're larger or not. But if not, video game numbers are certainly right up there as one of the art forms. But
there's also a point to say that like you go watch a movie with your mates, but you can't really play a narrative-driven game with your friends unless you're all on board with it, because it's a big
Yeah.
commitment to play a narrative game. Like a
Yeah,
movie
yeah,
could be like 2 hours
absolutely.
long,
Imagine
but to
trying to
like sit
play.
down and play through,
Yeah, it's a personal experience. Playing a Final Fantasy game, you're doing that by yourself. And if you try and stream it or whatever, it is difficult to get people to kind of come along for the ride. They've got to sit in for a 40-hour stream over however many sessions or whatever. Um, there are people that can do that, but again, that's a niche within a niche within a niche within a niche. For most part, the story-driven games are definitely a personal experience, which is different to what a lot of people come to video games for. People like to play video games for the social experience. It's rare to have a developer try to resolve those. The Dark Pictures are a good example of that, though, that they try and create
fun.
narrative driven games that are enjoyable in a social context. And I think they're actually quite
They're
well
also a
written for
lot
that.
shorter.
Yes, they are much shorter, but I think they're quite well written for that. Actually, I think the Dark Picture games. I do have issues with the anthology concept and the way they handled that, but looking at them as individual games, I think they're pretty effective, kind of fun social horror experiences, and they're very well written with that in mind.
They capture the exact same experience of renting a copy of like the Scream 3 in
Yes,
2005
absolutely. They're like
and with your
the
mates.
that thing that the bad horror that you'd hire with your mates and then watch at midnight, and then it's kind of you'd laugh at it and have a good time.
Mm.
They've done a great job with that.
But
Yeah.
there's not really that equivalent for a lot of other genres, really. Like horror is doing it well. That in addition to Dark Pictures, there's lots of hour-long or 2-hour-long experiences that you can share with people. But an adventure, for example, you don't have that.
Yeah, you can't really have like a version of Indiana Jones. Like Uncharted doesn't work in the same way. You can't enjoy that in a similar way.
You can't enjoy Uncharted at all.
That's wrong. That game's fun.
No, it's
They're
terrible.
fun. They're silly. They're fun. It's about a guy who goes like bang and collects
They're
treasure. It's
murder
fine.
simulators.
It's been very
Bloody
funny,
everything's a murder
actually.
simulator.
Speaking of Naughty Dog, is watching my coworkers who have never played video games talk about The Last of Us. And like I'm sure the writers for that TV show would have done heaps and heaps to flesh out the what the game's story was. But it's still kind of so fascinating to see the discussions of characters and motivations and things like that, which you do when you watch TV, but you don't do when you play games. Well, you do sometimes, you do less.
Yeah, but it's also like more of a nerd thing to do that while playing games, in all honesty. And I'm saying
Yep.
that as someone who does that.
We're all nerds here.
We are.
Yeah.
Trent,
Yeah.
you've been very quiet there. Give
It's
us a game that has a good narrative.
Good narrative. Let's see. Like all of those games I like for like the opening window,
Are you about
introduction
to say
sections.
He's about to
Final
say that.
Fantasy Tactics
Yeah,
Advance?
he's about to
Yes,
say
because
the
it's a
snowball
good-
fight.
good
do
it
like
is
that.
a good narrative introduction,
Trent, have you played that game beyond that opening?
No, he hasn't. He absolutely.
I-
I'm convinced he has not. He's only played. He's tried to play it like 100 times, and every single time he just plays the opening snowball fight, and that's it. That's as far as he gets.
No, okay. I didn't get all the way. I haven't finished the game.
You beat the first mission.
No, I've done. When you're in Deliverance or whatever it's called, you end up having to go to like another island or something. Does that sound right? No.
Not quite.
I mean,
do you remember the younger brother?
Vaguely.
Because I love the narrative of that game. I think the premise of that game is
No, that game is
genuinely
really good.
amazing. Yeah, it's a really, really good story.
People also shit on that game for some reason because it
It's
was
'cause
like
it's not as good
marked
as
as a
Tactics
horrible
Four.
character.
No,
Yes.
I think the
It's a terrible
reason
person.
people tend to be critical of it is it just didn't have the narrative quality or the overall narrative quality of
No, but
the
it
original
does.
Final
It's so
the
good.
original Final Fantasy Tactics,
Okay.
which was
Okay, yeah.
yeah.
It's not as good as, but Matsuno wrote that, and he's the best. So.
No, I'm not saying that Final Fantasy Tactics Advance doesn't have a good narrative. I think it does. I just say that the original, the one that people compare it to directly, is kind of
Yeah.
masterpiece territory. We're talking about
Set the bar too high.
that level of narrative, and they were never going to meet that. I thought that what they did with it was really neat. I quite liked
Yeah.
Tactics Advance. I thought I really liked the idea of the never-ending story quality of it. Really, the the way that they got drawn into the fantasy novel as such was really neat.
I thought it was just nice how it's not an escapist fantasy, because March is the only one of the kids who like doesn't really have anything too wrong with his situation when he goes in the fantasy world, and all of his friends like they gain confidence. His brother like gains the ability to walk, right?
Yeah.
And his
Yeah.
character arc is thinking like, do we
Well,
end this world?
I really liked how the kind of the escapist fantasy for these characters made them bad as such, if that makes sense. Like
Hmm.
like the escapism, the denial of reality was the villain of the game as such. I quite like that. The
So
message,
it's
I
a
guess,
very
being that
nuanced
you
villain, I guess, because it's like it is something that grants them positive qualities. And yeah, this is the conversation that we don't have about games, right? How many games can we actually discuss the themes like this and actually say what is it trying to say about escapism, what it's trying to say about its characters? Like that's so rare.
yeah, and that's something that I've been railing against for much. I mean, one of the main reasons I set up digitally downloaded all those years ago was because I wanted to have those conversations about games, and I didn't see that they were getting fulfilled um, through a lot of the discourse. Final Fantasy games in particular, every single Final Fantasy game has some quality to it beyond the stuff that people talk about. Final Fantasy X, for example, everybody always talks about how Titus's laugh is absolutely terrible. Um, but there's a
And
lot to
they're
that
wrong,
game.
first of all.
No, they're right. They are right about that scene. What a terrible scene that was. One of the worst scenes in
I'm
video game
offended.
history. But
You've clearly not played Far Cry 6.
but these games all have that kind of depth to them. And while we're talking about Final Fantasy, I think the writer behind both Strangers of Paradise and Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's the same writer.
King.
That guy's a fucking
Absolute
genius.
king.
He is a genius because in both of those games, he completely deconstructed the material, the source material. So Strangers of Paradise, he completely deconstructed the original Final Fantasy, and then Final Fantasy VII Remake, he made a game that was in many ways a response to Final Fantasy VII, not a retelling of it. And that stuff is that's kind of when you get to that point, you're looking at video games as very much the equivalent to what the theorists and what the smart people and the philosophers are doing with film and literature and stuff. You're looking at kind of the Goddard of video games.
God, out of video games.
Well, I think I might be the first person to say that. But that kind of thought process, the sheer thought that he put into writing those and kind of deconstructing them and pulling them apart and satirizing them, and then still vaguely having the plot follow what the original was. I thought those two games were both really smart ways to continue to build on what Final Fantasy does in the video game industry.
It's interesting how we don't really elevate game authors to the same level of renowned status that film or well every other thing does. But also every time that we've done it, it's never or it's rarely ended too well.
It's so rarely been a thing that actually deserves to get that attention, you know what I mean? It's usually like Matt saying, The Last of Us. Which it's the road. Cool. Revenge bad. Nice.
But like David Cage, for example, we spent so much time with Heavy Rain
God.
being like, wow, this man's a genius.
We're doing a section on good writing, and let's talk about
Sorry.
David Cage. Yeah.
No, but when Heavy Rain came out,
Robots,
everyone was
but
genuinely
Harvard.
like, this is the best games writing that we've seen.
The robots sit at the back of the bus. Do you remember that? That was really subtle. It was really, really smart. I found it really interesting personally. I've never read a book before. I'm so interesting.
Uh, I mean, you are right in a sense, Harvard, but I don't know. I think a good counter to David Cage is Kojima, you know. We've also
Dude's
elevated him.
insane.
We've also elevated him as a writer, and he certainly hasn't gone wrong for us.
But it means that
I mean, Death
you hating
Stranding,
him
what
for
I
the longest
like
time,
about
though.
Death Stranding is not the writing as such. I like how wanky
What?
well, no,
Dude,
it's okay. It's
Death
good.
Stranding
always
has
was.
written like a.
I
Look.
like the wankeriness of like the presentation, if that makes sense. Like, you know, you're just walking and then all of a sudden you hear like low roar in the distance. Like, you know, that kind of stuff, like, you know, is more exciting than like, you know, like the story's good, but like, you know, it's like let's
Trent,
run
you are
on the
not allowed to say
beach.
anything, but
Let's
the
run
story
on the
is
beach like we're
genius.
Princess Peach. Like, you know,
It's
like it's
genius.
obviously, you know, it's got some weirdness
It's
to
a shit
it.
take. It's like an absolute like piss and shit take, like on everything that like modern games expect
We have
to
to we
like have in them, and I love that.
we have to go back to like before Death Stranding came out and the podcast we did on Kojima, and
And you hated him.
compare and contrast my opinions of Kojima from before playing that game to after playing that game. That game is just written brilliantly, absolutely
It's a point of
brilliantly
interest, Matt.
written game.
Have you tried going back and playing like Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, and 3?
That's a good question. No, I haven't, and I really should because
Because I think you might really enjoy them now.
I think you're right. Like, yeah, I freely like I freely admit that I had no patience for Kojima before Death Stranding. And yeah, after playing Death Stranding, I've become a big time fan. So I think you're right. I probably will latch onto what he's saying with those games better than I think I was prepared to give him credit for beforehand. So I definitely should play them.
You really enjoy them.
Plus, I also found out that he was a Che Guevara fanboy, and I'm sure those are in
Well, you're gonna
those
love
games.
Matt. You'll love MGS3.
Yeah.
MGS3 is the most political
Yeah, it's
and
surprising how
Cold War
political those
story.
games get.
I mean, he called everything. Like he called the future in Metal Gear Solid 2.
Well,
Like
he called the future
he
in Death
predicted
Stranding
everything. Yeah.
too.
Called the future in basically everything he's written. I'm
Yeah.
waiting for Space Ninjas personally.
Did he write Revengeance? Please tell me he wrote Revengeance.
I think he consulted on Revengeance,
Oh,
but there was
okay.
still Space Ninjas in 4.
Was Revengeance was Platinum Games, wasn't it?
It was.
Oh yes, it was, and it owned.
I was waiting for the American president to roid himself up and beat the hell out of society's ills.
I'll tell you what, Platinum Games
Yeah.
is a really good example of a studio that writes a lot of really good stuff and very rarely gets credit for it. Like a lot of their games are really smart written things, but because they're such a action kind of orientated gameplay behind
People see the
them,
cutscenes.
people kind of overlook just how well written they are. Like Bayonetta, for example, really well written stuff. Like the character of Bayonetta is a masterclass in how to write a character. And people tend to overlook that because they're just like, oh, it's just really good action game. And it is a really good action game as well. You know, Platinum definitely deserves a reputation for their action as well. But yeah, their writing, the quality of their stories and their characters and all that kind of stuff is actually really good, much better than they generally get credit for.
Vanquish was a very, very well written game. Like
Vanquish
kind
owns.
of Metal Gear Solid level good military writing.
Yeah, I've got to play Vanquish. Vanquish is quite short too, isn't it?
It's been like 6 hours, yeah.
Yeah, I've got
It's
to give it
anywhere
a go.
between 5 and 12 hours, depending on how fast you go.
Yeah, I've got to give that one a go.